Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Healthcare du Jour is brought to you by Healthcare Now Radio, part of the Media Answers Network, and is sponsored by the law offices of Myrick O'Connell. Now here's your host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is Vincent Keunen, founder and CEO of Andaman7. And Vincent is also another one of the HIMSS digital influencers, so part of the series of recordings that I've been doing with all my fellow influencers. So Vincent, welcome to the show today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So Vincent, what I always like to do before really diving into conversations is to let my guest have the floor to give a little bit more of an introduction in terms of who you are and what you do. So the floor is yours.
Okay. My background is in software engineering, and I spent most of my careers, which is more than 25 years now, in the software for the health sector. I'm based here in Belgium, Europe. So here we did quite significant projects that include the majority of hospitals in Belgium, and also a lot of work around prevention. And these were projects that I did in my previous company that I was lucky enough to sell my company in 2014. So I have a lot of experience in managing health data, exchanging health data with all the security and privacy issues. And then in parallel to that, in 2007, I was diagnosed with a CML, chronic myeloid leukemia, which is a blood cancer. But I'm very fortunate to be on a super efficient pill, which is named Gleevec. And that's a very, very efficient pill for 95% of all patients. It restores your life expectancy to normal. And before the drug, you would have a few months to maximum 2 years of life expectancy. So it's really changing your expectations from something very dark and sad to a normal life again. Unfortunately, 3 months after me, my son, Peter, was diagnosed with also a cancer, another cancer. It's a bone cancer, and he was 10 years old, so extremely young. It was very tough for him because he went through a very difficult chemotherapy, then radiotherapy, then bone marrow transplant, and then finally was amputated from his right leg. So today we are more than 10 years after those two events, and we are both alive. So thank you to modern medicine. However, his experience and mine were critically different. Mine was somehow very easy because that very efficient pill really solved the problem of my cancer. While for my son, it was very terrible, and it lasted almost 2 years. And now of course, he has this handicap for the rest of his life. He's working with the processes. So this is about the story behind Andaman7 and why I decided to create that project and that company.
So I think you were saying you were involved with healthcare for, it sounds like, most of your career. How did your personal experience and experiencing your son's journey in the healthcare system change your perspective on how the system operates?
Yeah, so before the sickness, I was working mainly for hospital systems, for doctor systems, for prevention systems. So it was more on the professional side. And then suddenly I became a patient. And with my son, I was the parent or close person to a patient. So I could see the other side. And I realized how much the patient does not have any tools for managing their health data, and how much the patient needs access to their data, and how terribly difficult it was for patients. So I realized that even though doctors sometimes complain about the software they're using, and correctly so, because the medical software is still hard to use, it can be improved. At least they have software, at least they have data, at least they can do something. And that is true for hospitals, for nurses, and for all their care professionals. But for patients, there's almost nothing. And the patient is really at the center of everything. Everybody realizes that when they go to a new doctor, the first thing that the doctors ask is, what's your history? What previous conditions you have? What are your allergies? What kinds of drugs are you taking? So everything comes from the patient, in fact. So the patient needs to have access to that data and in a clear way. And in an age where on your smartphone you have your your calendar, your contacts, your photos, your bank, your everything that is important is on your smartphone, except maybe your health data. At least it's not complete, and you don't have a way to easily collect data from the various many scattered sources where you should collect your data, like one or several hospitals, your doctor, family doctor, maybe your physio, the lab where you have your blood tests, and then the devices that you may use now to follow up on your health. So there is really something missing there, an unmet need, and there are new technologies and possibilities to improve that. So that's why I decided to create Andaman7.
So kind of, as you said, thinking about maybe to some degree balancing, even if that might not be necessarily the right word, but trying to give patients the ability to have electronic tools and access to their information. Kind of what is the landscape look like in Europe? I think a lot of listeners hear a lot about the U.S. system, but it would be interesting to hear, kind of what is the current state of things for you in Belgium, and if you're able to kind of across the continent, and where you see things evolving.
Okay. So in Europe, the situation differs quite significantly between the countries today, unfortunately. So we have a, quote, unique, unquote, regulations or legislation, which is the GDPR, which is reinforcing a previous law from 2002 about patient rights. And this is uniform in Europe, right? At least in theory. In practice, some countries tend to add extra constraints and so on, but globally, we can say that it's quite uniform. However, the approach and the culture is very different. For example, some northern countries like Denmark, I believe, and I think Sweden also, have agreed to have a central repository for all health data of all the citizens. But most other countries have very strongly argued against that. And even some large projects have been killed. In Belgium, for example, the government decided some 15 years ago to create some kind of centralized system like that. And the associations of doctors went on strike to avoid that, because they didn't want that the government would have too much information on the citizen. It was a big brother is watching you conspiracy, and all of this really went against centralization. So you have now in various European countries an approach which is much more decentralized, where the data stays where it is generated. So the hospital generate data and they keep it locally in the hospital, but they establish networks between hospitals whereby a doctor in hospital A can see his patient's data from hospital B if the patient has been to hospital B in the past. So there is another approach to this, which is distributed data, and it's a lot more complex technically, of course. Somehow it's probably less risky because there is no central point of failure, no central point of attack for hackers. But that means also that the situation in various countries is different. That's for the global hospital approach. Now, for patients, unfortunately, access to their data is still very, very, very limited. It's not very different from the US. And I would tend to believe that the US are moving much, much faster than we are towards interoperability and patient rights. And first, everything around Obamacare and the FHIR APIs to access data, then the meaningful use recommendations, and now the new recommendations from the government about access by patients to their data in a very wide manner. I think this is moving the needle very, very nicely, and we are nowhere near that in Europe. We are working on interoperability issues, but there is no constraints or legal constraints. Well, there are legal constraints, but they are not applied. And in practice, it's still very hard to get access to your data. And the best you can do today is go to your hospital, ask for a CD-ROM with a copy of your data. Sometimes your hospital has a portal, which is already a first step. That's good. But for me, a portal is totally insufficient. A portal means that you have to connect to 1, 2, 3, 4 portals if you have to see your data in various locations. You don't have an easy way to collect your data, to copy your data. You don't have an easy way to share it with who you want. So for me, the approach of a mobile app where you locally store all your health data is extremely more powerful than a portal. So yes, the situation in Europe is still very difficult, and I think the US is moving much faster.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting perspective because it's, I get the sense that many here might not agree that the US is necessarily moving quite as fast. It's, as you were kind of referencing, there is a lot of discussion, and we have pending regulations from the federal government that could help improve access. But, kind of some of the barriers that you were talking about of facilities not necessarily responding in a desirable manner, if at all, are also kind of some of the challenges that individuals face in the US, despite having HIPAA here, which gives an individual the right of access.
Yeah, but I think the situation is at least being discussed quite widely in the US, and I've seen all the press around the EPIC CEO that was opposing some upcoming regulations, and the patient association lobbying strongly against that. And so at least it's being discussed clearly, and the patient's voice are heard. And there are patients associations that really do very good work. In Europe, I don't see that happening at all. Patients are more quiet. I don't know why. And hospitals are not moving because they are not forced to somehow, right? So they're probably waiting to be more pressured to move, because for the moment they're not doing much. So yeah, the situation is less clear in Europe, less good, I would say, in Europe, even though we have those regulations that are supposed to put the citizen and the patient in the center, but we still have those fears and those lack of will to go forward from hospitals, from doctors, and so on. And also the interoperability, the technical issues are much stronger, because in the US, most EHR vendors now do have a FHIR API. And that's not the case for most European software vendors. So that's really a technical challenge. And another one also is simply languages, right? If you store conditions of a patient in French, well, no German, no Italian, no Spanish doctor will be able to understand it. So in our case, we absolutely need to have the codification systems in place. I'm talking about the Loing system, the SNOMED system, and those which codify, for example, the flu with a number, and that number can be used to translate from French to German to Italian, right? So it's an additional problem that is probably less critical in the US, where the language is a bit more uniform.
No, I think those are very fair points. And for those of you just joining, I'm talking with Vincent Keunen from Andaman, and we've been Andaman7, and we've been talking about some of the distinctions between individual access to health data and challenges between Europe and the US. And Vincent, kind of picking up on what you were just talking about around highlighting one of the kind of challenges of interoperability in Europe being language differences from country to country, and I think sometimes even within a country. From your background as a software engineer, kind of what do you see as some of the ways to help address and overcome those issues?
Yeah, the difficulty is that you could say that there are two ways to store data, I would say, structured and unstructured. Unstructured is the doctor is writing or dictating what the condition is and what the treatment is and so on. And unfortunately, 7 to 80% of all hospital data, that's I think universal, both in the US and in Europe, is text. So it's unstructured data. So that kind of data, you can only present it to a human to read it, understand, and then it can proceed. It's very hard to compute that data. To be able to compute that data, you have to codify it after the fact, right? And there are a lot of initiatives with that, mostly based on machine learning, various AI techniques, natural language processing techniques, and so on. But it's still very hard to do. And what's important is that the accuracy must be extremely high so that doctors will rely on that. Suppose now it's around 85% of success. That means that in 15% of the cases, the condition that will be detected by the software is wrong. That's huge. That's a big problem because doctors obviously don't want to rely on wrong diagnostics or wrong information to make a decision on your treatment, right? So those techniques that are trying to codify existing unstructured texts must be extremely good to be really usable in the real world. And also those techniques depend on the language, of course, right? If you make a lot of progress with natural language processing in English, you still nowhere in French, in German, and Italian, right? So you have to apply those techniques to all the languages. That is for the unstructured text, which is the large majority of what's available in the hospitals. Of course, quite a few years ago already, there were a number of people that said, okay, if we want to progress, we need to codify the information. So when you say the patient has flu, you don't write flu, but you enter the code for flu, right? And various kinds of flu have different codes. So when you do that, the information is a lot richer. It can be used for processing, like selecting all patients that have more than 2 occurrences of flu over the last 10 years. That becomes possible. But at the same time, you get also the capabilities to translate that term or that code in various languages. So that's positive. The big difficulty that it takes a lot of time for doctors to enter that information. And the medical world is so complex that, for example, you have 300,000 terms in SNOMED for conditions and various diagnostics and so on. So it's a huge body of knowledge. It's a huge number of codes, and it makes it extremely difficult in practice to use these codes for doctors. So we're still evolving towards those kinds of systems, but for them to be really, really useful and not too constraining to doctors, we will need to have software tools that will greatly help the doctors to enter the data in a structured way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think so. Because I think kind of as you're saying, it's because the physicians want to have very specific and targeted information. As you're saying, it's a lot easier to put that into a text-based format, which, as you were explaining, is unstructured data, as opposed to becoming, I guess, the equivalent of a data entry clerk of having to scroll through thousands upon thousands of codes to present the same information. But that distinction, if I'm understanding correctly, is part of what drives the difficulty from the software perspective, because for software, it's much easier for that to sort through a code as opposed to having to learn how to read text.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. Correct.
So I guess, do you see any promise for software to be able to help take over that step? And I think you were starting to suggest this, of take over the step of converting the free text into the code that can then become more universally applied, or be able to more easily run through an algorithm or other electronic system?
Yes, there is a lot of work and research on that, right? Both on trying to look at previously entered text, like the history of a patient, and try to codify that after the fact, or to be able to codify immediately when a doctor is either typing text or when he's dictating verbally text. And with all the progress now of the Google, the Alexa, the Siri, all those systems that are improving voice to text, that is a first step. You need to do voice to text and then text to code somehow, right? So we're getting closer and closer to that. So I see the huge progress that is happening in the last few years. And the importance now of NLP, so natural language processing, machine learning, and AI, which are really the buzzwords of the moment. There's a lot of initiatives in that direction and a lot of funding too. So I'm pretty optimistic about the great progress that we can make, but it's still difficult. It's still a very challenging research topic because you somehow need to almost understand what the doctor is saying, right, to be able to codify correctly. So you face all the challenges of a software system that needs to go much beyond listening to voice and translating to text. You need to understand the sentence, the IDs, and then that will help you codify it correctly. So there's a lot of progress, but there's a lot of challenges too.
Yes, and I think that's very accurate, especially because, as you're saying, if it's having to really understand what's being said, that also means having to figure out, different idiosyncrasies among how different physicians might present the same type of information. One physician might use acronym or abbreviation A, and the physician in the next facility could use a different acronym just because there are different acceptable ways of presenting the same information. So it's, it also seems like a standardization process, which arguably might be impossible, is a big challenge to have to overcome as well.
Yeah, that's very true. And the medical sector is not something as strict as accounting or physics or chemistry. It's a lot more. I don't know the words to use for that, but
yeah, I think there's a bit more variation because there's not kind of one. I think from treatment there's a common set of rules, but in terms of documenting around it, I've always heard that that's one of the challenges at least in the U.S. when it comes to interoperability is, even like something as common as like a date, you can order it in a bunch of different ways. You could have, say, year, month, day, month, year, any combination. And if someone's not entering the value in the same way, it could confuse a software program because it might be set up to read it in one particular way.
Yeah, right. So standardization is the word you use, and I think it's really true that we absolutely need that, and that's difficult. And for doctors, it's also difficult to kind of be constrained by a standard where that is complex, 300,000 terms for SNOMED, for example, and also they're not always comfortable with the code being sufficiently accurate to describe what they need to describe. And then sometimes the context has some importance and side information has importance. So how do you manage all of that? It's complex by nature.
Yeah, no, and also thinking about how those code systems kind of continue to evolve, because it's not like SNOMED or CPT or any of those or ICD have stayed the same since they were introduced. They're always updating, because it kind of is, as you're saying, as we get more data and more information, can drill down into things more. So it could be that data from 5 years ago doesn't translate to now because that coding was limited, and now we have a better understanding. So it's, not that maybe that's not unique to healthcare, but kind of given the gravity of what could happen if you're being presented with inaccurate data within healthcare, it is definitely yet another layer of the challenge to have to work through.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah,
I think we've covered a lot of ground, and it's it sounds like there are, as we've been saying, there are a lot of challenges, but at the same time there is still a fair degree of kind of promise. So I'm kind of interested, as believe it or not, we're already getting really close to the end of our time. What has you really excited about the future of healthcare right now?
Well, I think that we are seeing a huge shift towards the patient, right? Which I think is very good for many reasons. First, the patient is the ultimate customer somehow, right? And is the ultimate payer. Even if in the US you have payers and insurance companies, in Europe you have social security, it's always paid by the citizen or the patient at the end, right? So the patient is always paying and is always concerned by the quality of care. And it concerns everybody, right? One day or another, you will have a problem. And if you don't have a problem, you might want to prevent any problems. So it's really a concern for everybody. So it's a global problem with the internet and the exchange of information that is so fast and almost free now. there is a very large amount of knowledge that can be exchanged between the various countries, and there is experiences that some countries do that make other countries think about how they can improve. So everything that is around the patient, I believe, is very important. And with the new technologies, first the internet and then the mobile phone, which, by the way, is a supercomputer in your hand, right? Accessible to almost anybody. You wouldn't have believed that in 10 years ago, for example, right? It's an extremely powerful piece of hardware and software that creates new opportunities, both for care. So when the patient is taking an active role in his own care, the results are much better. There have been many studies on this showing that empowering the patient is not only nice and good for him, it's also good for the treatment, right? So this is very important for the patient, and that's for the care part. For the research part, which by research I mean pharma companies, medical device manufacturers, and all of those actors or stakeholders, they really need data and more data. And it's always getting more difficult to get data because of privacy becoming an issue in European countries. It's very clear with the GDPR, but with the California Privacy Act and similar regulation that will come from other states in the US, we are getting more aware that data must be private in some cases. So we have to manage how can we share the data for research while keeping the privacy of people. So those are new challenges, but with the technologies like smartphones, internet, so easy communication and almost free communication, and then everything around AI and around machine learning and all of those, I think there is a room for great improvements and more for rare diseases, because if you have 10% of the population that has a problem, it's obvious that many people will be interested in trying to solve that problem, like diabetes, like cancer, and all of those. But if you talk about rare diseases, where only 100,000 patients over the world have that problem, then who is going to do something for those people? And with the prices going down and the power of the new technologies, then we can hope to serve those patients better also. And then after that, the big step, and I don't think it's going to be a step, it's going to be gradual improvement, is everything around prevention. Once we understand better how diseases develop, what are the real causes of the diseases, then we will be able to suggest lifestyle changes or even treatments that would come very early on, and that would prevent the illness from occurring at all. So prevention will also be a big research area, I believe.
Yeah, no, that is definitely a lot to be excited about, and I think a lot to keep track of. So as I already mentioned, believe it or not, we are already out of time. I want to thank my guest, Vincent Keunen, for a great conversation today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm pleased, and I think that in this world of health, it's not about competing, but it's collaborating to improve the health of everybody, because we all concern one day or another.
And thank you to everyone listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at #HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.